So I take very seriously the conversation you had with the Governor of the Bank of England, who was sitting in this chair last week. And when Mark Carney says that the risk of a slowdown in economic growth, possibly a recession, if we end up exiting the EU, if Mark Carney is right, then that is a severe concern for the National Health Service, because it would be very dangerous if at precisely the moment the NHS is going to need extra funding, actually the economy goes into a tailspin and that funding is not there.
What would that mean in real terms for the NHS?
Well, we can see that we've got a clear plan to improve cancer services, saving 30,000 lives over the next 5 years. We need to upgrade our mental health services. We need to strengthen primary care. In order to put the fuel in the tank, we will need the proceeds of economic growth. The truth, Andrew,
an
is
economic shock would actually put lives at risk. You wouldn't get the cancer care and so forth that you would otherwise be able to invest in.
It's been true for the 68 years of the NHS's history that when the British economy sneezes, the NHS catches a cold. And this would be a terrible moment for that to happen at precisely the time the NHS is going to need that extra investment.
So as the man in charge of the NHS, you are saying to voters now, vote to stay inside the EU to protect the NHS.
It's not my job to do that at all. I'm simply assessing
I think you've just done it, actually.
No, I'm simply looking at speaking for the NHS and talking about what the NHS will require. And I think any nurse, any doctor, any patient will tell you that over time the NHS is going to need more investment. So the reality is that anything that puts that at risk is of deep concern. Let
me put you the other side of the argument then, which is in Mark Carney's comments and in all the other comments, where there's lots of perhapses, ifs, oughts, maybes, mayhapses, as it were. Mayhaps is an old word, which I've just reintroduced in the English language. Whereas on the other side, the Brexit side, they're saying, here is the absolutely concrete £10 billion bonus that we get from leaving the EU, and it goes to you guys. You are swapping a concrete, serious, upfront and relatively quick offer of money for the worry of what might happen in the distant future.
Unfortunately, the UK Statistics Authority has shown that that isn't actually money that would be available to the NHS. Because when you net off what we give with what we receive, it's a rather lower figure than that. And that lower figure, Andrew, even if all of it were deployed to the NHS, is enough to fund the NHS for 19 days each year.
So for the other,
that will fund us for 19 days a year. So for the other 11 and a half months of the year, it's the performance of the economy that is what will count.
So you reject that argument. What about the argument about migration? Because Theresa May admitted that, we could very well see an extra 3 million people coming in from across the EU if we stay. And then there's the arguments about Turkey and so forth. And one of the big pressures on the NHS right now in A&E departments is the sheer number of extra people coming through the doors. More migration means more people coming through those doors, puts more pressure on the NHS and makes the crisis worse, not better.
Well, the NHS actually has benefited enormously from EU nurses and doctors who we successfully recruit and who help staff our hospitals and our nursing homes.
Sure.
And so take an example, Penny Mordaunt's local hospital. I was looking at the figures as she was talking. In her local hospital, 80 of the doctors are from the rest of the European Union. 350 nurses in her local hospital from the European Union. But if only a proportion of those chose to up sticks and off on the 24th of June, that will create real problems in hospitals across the country.
But in a sense, why would they? There's a Strasbourg agreement. They don't have to go. They can stay if they want to stay. That wouldn't necessarily. And overall, the number of EU
if there's uncertainty about work permits, about migration regimes, passports and all the rest of it, my point is that actually the NHS has benefited greatly from the ability to have European Union nurses alongside the increases we need in British-trained nurses, doctors, which we're putting in place.
So in proportional terms and in raw terms, there are far more from India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and so forth, and from the rest of the EU. I think across the whole of the NHS, EU employees are only around 5%, so it's not Armageddon.
Well, we've got about 130,000 European Union nurses, doctors, care workers in the NHS and in care homes, and we would surely miss the effect, the impact, the benefit they would bring were some of them to choose to leave. But you ask a related question, which is about the impact of migration, the pressure on services that places. And look, this is not black and white. It clearly is the case that where those migrants are paying taxes, that is contributing to the revenues that can afford an expanding NHS. When the NHS was set up in 1948, we had a population of 50 million in this country. We're at, 65 million now. So the NHS has perfectly successfully coped with a 15 million expansion in our population. Provided it is properly resourced from the proceeds of economic growth, it can do that. So, yes, there's a perfectly legitimate argument to be had on these topics, but from the NHS's perspective, it is pretty clear that the balance of the advantage is such that the risks would be greater were we to find ourselves in economic downturn, were we to find a number of our nurses and doctors contemplating leaving, and indeed if the pound were affected, because a lot of the drug treatments that we buy are priced in euros and dollars, so that could make it more difficult for us to get the treatments that we need at an affordable price.
That's pretty clear. It's a big moment